The homework economy. The new industrial revolution is producing a new worldwide working class. The extreme mobility of capital and the emerging international division of labor are intertwined with the emergence of new collectivities and the weakening of familiar groupings. These developments are neither gender nor race neutral. White men in advanced industrial societies have become newly vulnerable to permanent job loss, and women are not disappearing from the job roles at the same rates as men. It is not simply that women in third world countries are the preferred labor force for the science-based multinationals in the export processing sectors, particularly in electronics. The picture is more systematic and involves reproduction, sexuality, culture, consumption, and production. In the prototypical Silicon Valley, many women's lives have been structured around employment in electronics-dependent jobs, and their intimate realities include serial heterosexual monogamy, negotiating childcare, distance from extended kin or most other forms of traditional community, a high likelihood of loneliness, and extreme economic vulnerability as they age. The ethnic and racial diversity of women in Silicon Valley structures a microcosm of conflicting differences in culture, family, religion, education, language. Richard Gordon has called this new situation the homework economy. Although he includes the phenomenon of literal homework emerging in connection with electronics assembly, Gordon intends homework economy to name a restructuring of work that broadly has the characteristics formerly ascribed to female jobs literally done only by women. Work is being redefined as both literally female and feminized, whether performed by men or women. To be feminized means to be made extremely vulnerable, able to be disassembled, reassembled, exploited as a reserve labor force, seen less as workers than as servers, subjected to time arrangements on and off the paid job that make a mockery of a limited workday, leading to existence that always borders on being obscene, out of place, and reducible to sex. Desk killing is an old strategy newly applicable to formerly privileged workers. However, the homework economy does not refer only to large-scale desk killing, nor does it deny that new areas of high skill are emerging, even for women and men previously excluded from skilled employment. Rather, the concept indicates that factory, home, and market are integrated on a new scale, and that the places of women are crucial and need to be analyzed for differences among women and for meanings for relations between men and women in various situations. The homework economy as a world capitalist organizational structure is made possible by, not caused by, the new technologies. The success of the attack on relatively privileged, mostly white, men's unionized jobs is tied to the power of the new communications technologies to integrate and control labor despite extensive dispersion and decentralization. The consequences of the new technologies are felt by women both in the loss of the family, male, wage, if they ever had access to this white privilege, and in the character of their own jobs, which are becoming capital intensive, e.g. office work and nursing. The new economic and technological arrangements are also related to the collapsing welfare state and the ensuing intensification of demands on women to sustain daily life for themselves as well as for men, children, and old people. The feminization of poverty, generated by dismantling the welfare state, by the homework economy where stable jobs become the exception, and sustained by the expectation that women's wage will not be matched by a male income for the support of children, has become an urgent focus. The causes of various women-headed households are a function of race, class, or sexuality, but their increasing generality is a ground for coalitions of women on many issues. That women regularly sustain daily life, partly as a function of their enforced status as mothers, is hardly new. The kind of integration with the overall capitalist and progressively war-based economy is new. The particular pressure, for example, on U.S. black women, who have achieved an escape from, barely, paid domestic service, and who now hold clerical and similar jobs in large numbers, has large implications for continued enforced black poverty with employment. Teenage women in industrializing areas of the Third World increasingly find themselves the sole or major source of a cash wage for their families, while access to land is ever more problematic. These developments must have major consequences in the psychodynamics and politics of gender and race. Within the framework of three major stages of capitalism, commercial, early industrial, monopoly, and multinational, tied to nationalism, imperialism, and multinationalism, and related to Jameson's three dominant aesthetic periods of realism, modernism, and postmodernism. I would argue that specific forms of families dialectically relate to forms of capital and to its political and cultural concomitants. Although lived problematically and unequally, ideal forms of these families might be schematized as 1. The patriarchal nuclear family, structured by the dichotomy between public and private and accompanied by the white bourgeois ideology of separate spheres and 19th century Anglo-American bourgeois feminism. 2. The modern family mediated or enforced by the welfare state and institutions like the family wage, with a flowering of afeminist heterosexual ideologies, including their radical versions represented in Greenwich Village around World War I. And 3. The family of the homework economy with its oxymoronic structure of women-headed households and its explosion of feminisms and the paradoxical intensification and erosion of gender itself. This is the context in which the projections for worldwide structural unemployment stemming from the new technologies are part of the picture of the homework economy. As robotics and related technologies put men out of work in developed countries and exacerbate failure to generate male jobs in third world development, and as the automated office becomes the rule, even in labor surplus countries, the feminization of work intensifies. Black women in the United States have long known what it looks like to face the structural underemployment, feminization of black men, as well as their own highly vulnerable position in the wage economy. It is no longer a secret that sexuality, reproduction, family, and community life are interwoven with this economic structure in myriad ways, which have also differentiated the situations of white and black women. Many more women and men will contend with similar situations, which will make cross-gender and race alliances on issues of basic life support, with or without jobs, necessary, not just nice. The new technologies also have a profound effect on hunger and on food production for subsistence worldwide. Ray Lesser, Bloomberg, estimates that women produce about 50% of the world's subsistence food. Women are excluded generally from benefiting from the increased high-tech commodification of food and energy crops. Their days are made more arduous because their responsibilities to provide food do not diminish, and their reproductive situations are made more complex. Green revolution technologies interact with other high-tech industrial production to alter gender divisions of labor and differential gender migration patterns. The new technologies seem deeply involved in the forms of privatization that Ross Petsky has analyzed, in which militarization, right-wing family ideologies and politics, and intensified definitions of corporate property as private synergistically interact. The new communications technologies are fundamental to the eradication of public life for everyone. This facilitates the mushrooming of a permanent high-tech military establishment at the cultural and economic expense of most people, but especially of women. Technologies like video games and highly miniaturized television seem crucial to production of modern forms of private life. The culture of video games is heavily oriented to individual competition and extraterrestrial warfare. High-tech, gendered imaginations are produced here, imaginations that can contemplate destruction of the planet and a sci-fi escape from its consequences. More than our imaginations is militarized, and the other realities of electronic and nuclear warfare are inescapable. The new technologies affect the social relations of both sexuality and of reproduction, and not always in the same ways. The close ties of sexuality and instrumentality, of views of the body as a kind of private satisfaction and utility maximizing machine, are described nicely in the sociobiological origin stories that stress a genetic calculus and explain the inevitable dialectic of domination of male and female gender roles. The conjunction of the Green Revolution's social relations with biotechnologies like plant genetic engineering makes the pressures on land in the Third World increasingly intense. AIDS estimates, New York Times, 14 December 1984, used as the 1984 World Food Day, are that of Africa, women produce about 90% of rural food supplies, about 60 to 80% in Asia, and provide 40% of agricultural labor in the Near East and Latin America. Bloomberg charges that World Organization's agricultural politics, as well as those of multinationals and national governments in the Third World, generally ignore fundamental issues in the sexual division of labor. The present tragedy of famine in Africa might owe as much to male supremacy as to capitalism, colonialism, and rain patterns. More accurately, capitalism and racism are usually structurally male-dominant. The new technologies affect the social relations of both sexuality and of reproduction, and not always in the same ways. The close ties of sexuality and instrumentality, of views of the body as a kind of private satisfaction and utility maximizing machine, are described nicely in sociobiological origin stories that stress a genetic calculus and explain the inevitable dialectic of domination of male and female gender roles. These sociobiological stories depend on a high-tech view of the body as a biotic component or cybernetic communications system. Among the many transformations of reproductive situations is the medical one, where women's bodies have boundaries newly permeable to both visualization and intervention. Of course, who controls the interpretation of bodily boundaries in medical hermeneutics is a major feminist issue. The speculum served as an icon of women's claiming their bodies in the 1970s. That handcraft tool is inadequate to express our needed body politics in the negotiation of reality in the practices of cyborg reproduction. Self-help is not enough. The technologies of visualization recall the important cultural practice of hunting with the camera and the deeply predatory nature of a photographic consciousness. Sex, sexuality, and reproduction are central actors in high-tech myth systems, structuring our imaginations of personal and social possibility. Another critical aspect of the social relations of the new technologies is the reformation of expectations, culture, work, and reproduction for the large scientific and technical workforce. A major social and political danger is the formation of a strongly bimodal social structure, with the masses of women and men of all ethnic groups, but especially people of color, confined to a homework economy, illiteracy of several varieties, and general redundancy and impotence, controlled by high-tech repressive apparatuses ranging from entertainment to surveillance and disappearance. Inadequate socialist feminist politics should address women in the privileged occupational categories, and particularly in the production of science and technology that construct scientific, technical discourses, processes, and objects. This issue is only one aspect of inquiry into the possibility of a feminist science, but it is important. What kind of constitutive role in the production of knowledge, imagination, and practice can new groups doing science have? How can these groups be allied with progressive social and political movements? What kind of political accountability can be constructed to tie women together across the scientific, technical hierarchy separating us? Might there be ways of developing feminist science, technology politics, in alliance with anti-military science facility, conversion action groups? Many scientific and technical workers in Silicon Valley, the high-tech cowboys included, do not want to work on military science. Can these personal preferences and cultural tendencies be welded into progressive politics among this professional middle class in which women, including women of color, are coming to be fairly numerous? Women in the integrated circuit. Let me summarize the picture of women's historical locations in advanced industrial societies, as these positions have been restructured partly through the social relations of science and technology. If it was ever possible ideologically to characterize women's lives by the distinction of public and private domains, suggested by images of the division of working-class life into factory and home, of bourgeois life into market and home, and of gender existence into personal and political realms, it is now a totally misleading ideology, even to show how both terms of these dichotomies construct each other in practice and in theory. I prefer a network ideological image, suggesting the profusion of spaces and identities and the permeability of boundaries in the personal body and in the body politic. Networking is both a feminist practice and a multinational corporate strategy. Weaving is for oppositional cyborgs. The only way to characterize the informatics of domination is as a massive intensification of insecurity and cultural impoverishment, with common failure of subsistence networks for the most vulnerable. Since much of this picture interweaves with the social relations of science and technology, the urgency of a socialist feminist politics addressed to science and technology is plain. There is much now being done, and the grounds for political work are rich. For example, the efforts to develop forms of collective struggle for women in paid work, like SEIU's District 925, should be a high priority for all of us. These efforts are profoundly tied to technical restructuring of labor processes and reformations of working classes. These efforts also are providing understanding of a more comprehensive kind of labor organization involving community, sexuality, and family issues never privileged in the largely white male industrial unions. The structural rearrangements related to the social relations of science and technology evoke strong ambivalence, but it is not necessary to be ultimately depressed by the implications of late 20th century women's relation to all aspects of work, culture, production of knowledge, sexuality, and reproduction. For excellent reasons, most Marxisms see domination best and have trouble understanding what can only look like false consciousness and people's complicity in their own domination in late capitalism. It is crucial to remember that what is lost, perhaps especially from women's points of view, is often virulent forms of oppression, nostalgically naturalized in the face of current violation. Ambivalence toward the disrupted unities mediated by high-tech culture requires not sorting consciousness into categories of clear-sighted critique grounding a solid political epistemology versus manipulated false consciousness, but subtle understanding of emerging pleasures, experiences, and powers with serious potential for changing the rules of the game. There are grounds for hope in the emerging bases for new kinds of unity across race, gender, and class, and these elementary units of socialist feminist analysis themselves suffer protean transformations. Intensifications of hardship experienced worldwide, in connection with the social relations of science and technology, are severe. But what people are experiencing is not transparently clear, and we lack sufficiently subtle connections for collectively building effective theories of experience. Present efforts, Marxist, psychoanalytic, feminist, anthropological, to clarify even our experience are rudimentary. I'm conscious of the odd perspective provided by my historical position. A PhD in biology for an Irish Catholic girl was made possible by Sputnik's impact on U.S. national science education policy. I have a body and mind as much constructed by the post-World War II arms race and Cold War as by the women's movements. There are more grounds for hope by focusing on the contradictory effects of politics designed to produce loyal American technocrats, which as well produce large numbers of dissidents, rather than by focusing on the present defeats. The permanent partiality of feminist points of view has consequences for our expectations or forms of political organization and participation. We do not need a totality in order to work well. The feminists dream of a common language, like all dreams for a perfectly true language, of perfectly faithful naming of experience, is a totalizing and imperialist one. In that sense, dialectics too is a dream language, longing to resolve contradiction. Perhaps, ironically, we can learn from our fusions with animals and machines how not to be man, the embodiment of Western logos. From the point of view of pleasure in these potent and taboo fusions, made inevitable by the social relations of science and technology, there might indeed be a feminist science. Cyborgs, a myth of political identity. I want to conclude with a myth about identity and boundaries, which might inform late 20th century political imaginations. I am indebted in this story to writers like Joanna Russ, Samuel Delany, John Varley, James Tiptree Jr., Octavia Butler, Monique Wittig, and Vonda McIntyre. These are our storytellers exploring what it means to be embodied in high-tech worlds. They are theorists for cyborgs. Exploring conceptions of bodily boundaries and social order, the anthropologist Mary Douglas should be credited with helping us to consciousness about how fundamental body imagery is to worldview, and so to political language. French feminists like Luce Irigaray and Monique Wittig, for all their differences, know how to write the body, how to weave eroticism, cosmology, and politics from imagery of embodiment, and especially for Wittig, from imagery of fragmentation and reconstitution of bodies. American radical feminists like Susan Griffin, Audre Lorde, and Adrienne Rich have profoundly affected our political imaginations, and perhaps restricted too much what we allow as a friendly body and political language. They insist on the organic, opposing it to the technological, but their symbolic systems and the related positions of ecofeminism and feminist paganism, replete with organicisms, can only be understood in Sandoval's terms as oppositional ideologies fitting the late 20th century. They would simply bewilder anyone not preoccupied with the machines and consciousness of late capitalism. In that sense, they are part of the cyborg world. But there are also great riches for feminists in explicitly embracing the possibilities inherent in the breakdown of clean distinctions between organism and machine and similar distinctions structuring the Western self. It is the simultaneity of breakdowns that cracks the matrices of domination and opens geometric possibilities. what might be learned from personal and political technological pollution. I will look briefly at two overlapping groups of texts for their insight into the construction of a potentially helpful cyborg myth, constructions of women of color and monstrous selves in feminist science fiction. Earlier I suggested that women of color might be understood as a cyborg identity, a potent subjectivity synthesized from fusions of outsider identities. There are material and cultural grids mapping this potential. Audre Lorde captures the tone in the title of her Sister Outsider. In my political myth, Sister Outsider is the offshore woman, whom U.S. workers, female and feminized, are supposed to regard as the enemy preventing their solidarity, threatening their security. Onshore, inside the boundary of the United States, Sister Outsider is a potential amidst the races and ethnic identities of women manipulated for division, competition, and exploitation in the same industries. Women of color are the preferred labor force for the science-based industries, the real women for whom the worldwide sexual market, labor market, and politics of reproduction kaleidoscope into daily life. Young Korean women hired in the sex industry and in electronics assembly are recruited from high schools, educated for the integrated circuit. Literacy, especially in English, distinguishes the cheap female labor so attractive to the multinationals. Contrary to Orientalist stereotypes of the oral primitive, literacy is a special mark of women of color, acquired by U.S. black women as well as men through a history of risking death to learn and to teach reading and writing. Writing has a special significance for all colonized groups. Writing has been crucial to the Western myth of the distinction of oral and written cultures, primitive and civilized mentalities, and more recently to the erosion of that distinction in postmodernist theories, attacking the phallogocentrism of the West, with its worship of the monotheistic, phallic, authoritative, and singular word, the unique and perfect name. Contests for the meanings of writing are a major form of contemporary political struggle. Releasing the play of writing is deadly serious. The poetry and stories of U.S. women of color are repeatedly about writing, about access to the power they signify, but this time that power must be neither phallic nor innocent. Cyborg writing must not be about the fall, the imagination of a once-upon-a-time wholeness before language, before writing, before man. Cyborg writing is about the power to survive, not on the basis of original innocence, but on the basis of seizing the tools to mark the world that marked them as other. The tools are often stories, retold stories, versions that reverse and displace the hierarchical dualisms of naturalized identities. In retelling origin stories, cyborg authors subvert the central myths of origin of Western culture. We have all been colonized by those origin myths, with their longing for fulfillment in apocalypse. The phallogocentric origin stories, most crucial for feminist cyborgs, are built into the literal technologies that write the world, biotechnology and microelectronics, that have recently textualized our bodies as code problems on the grid of C31. Feminist cyborg stories have the task of recoding communication and intelligence to subvert command and control. Figuratively and literally, language politics pervade the struggles of women of color, and stories about language have a special power in the rich contemporary writing by U.S. women of color. For example, retellings of the story of the indigenous woman Malinche, mother of the mestizo bastard race of the New World, master of languages, and mistress of Cortes, carry special meaning for Chicana constructions of identity. Cherry Moraga, in Loving in the War Years, explores the themes of identity when one never possessed the original language, never told the original story, never resided in the harmony of legitimate heterosexuality in the garden of culture, and so cannot base identity on a myth or a fall from innocence, and right to natural names, mothers or fathers. Moraga's writing, her superb literacy, is presented in her poetry as the same kind of violation as Malinche's mastery of the conqueror's language. A violation, an illegitimate production, that allows survival. Moraga's language is not whole. It is self-consciously spliced, a chimera of English and Spanish, both conquerors' languages. But it is this chimeric monster, without claim to an original language before violation, that crafts the erotic, competent, potent identities of women of color. Sister Outsider hints at the possibility of world survival not because of her innocence, but because of her ability to live on the boundaries, to write without the founding myth of original wholeness, with its inescapable apocalypse of final return to a deathly oneness that man has imagined to be the innocent and all-powerful mother, freed from the end from another spiral of appropriation by her son. Writing marks Moraga's body, affirms it as the body of a woman of color, against the possibility of passing into the unmarked category of the Anglo father, or into the Orientalist myth of original illiteracy of a mother that never was. Malinche was mother here, not Eve before eating the forbidden fruit. Writing affirms Sister Outsider, not the woman before the fall into writing, needed by the phallogocentric family of man.